Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we talked to Abhi Sivasailam. Abhi was most recently the head of growth and analytics at Flexport, and during his tenure, the company's size grew by more than 10x. So this guy has seen growth. We talked to Abhi about the role of growth, why he believes growth and data need to sit under one leader, and how he helps companies set and execute strategy.
I really enjoyed this conversation because Abhi is one of the most opinionated data leaders that I've ever met. You know, when you talk to many data leaders, they talk to you about like navigating the idea maze of like, there's so many different ways to run an organization from a process and team structure and all of it. It's just like a novel space that we haven't all figured out all the answers on. But when you talk to Abhi, he's just like, nope, here's how to do it. I've done it 4 times. I've done it 20 times. I've got a series of playbooks. I know it works. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for that. I've never worked on the team that Abhi has led, but I have partnered with him in a consulting context before. And I have to say that it's impressive.
Yeah, I had the similar thought when I first met him. I was like, wow, your setup's actually not that traditional, what you like require of a company that you're going to partner with. Like, how do you get other companies to think about combining the data team and the growth under one function? And he's like, there's no other way. And if the CEO like doesn't like it,
then I don't take that job.
Yeah, I'm not going to take that job, or like, let me go to bat and try to help whoever he's consulting at make the case. So this is a fun episode. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Abhi, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
So we are going to go, if I have any instinct based on my conversations with you over the past several years, we are going to go all over the place today, cover a lot of fun stuff.
All over the place. It's going to take 3 hours.
Yeah, it's going to be a Joe Rogan special. Oftentimes at the beginning of our episodes, I try to ask some questions that summarize a guest's journey to where they are today. But in looking at your journey, it's been an interesting one. You've bounced around to a bunch of different things. You've seen a lot over the past, I don't know, what's it been, 10 or so years. How about you just summarize your own journey to this point?
Yeah. So, like a lot of folks on the show and a lot of folks that we know, I am a failed would-be academic, right? That's my life. So, I originally wanted to be an applied microeconomist, and went to grad school for stats, and then decided to take a year in the private sector before going to PhD programs. From there, I ended up doing just a variety of different things. I ended up at some point at Accenture, and at that point, their brand new data science, so management consulting, but focused on data science. And I ended up, building really cool stuff with huge data sets. Fortune 50 companies, and they were being rolled out to millions of customers. And I realized, it's not really the econ that I love or ever loved. It's really the data. It's really the statistics, the science, the analysis. It's really the data stuff. And so I'm just going to stay doing data stuff. And so that's what I did. And so then jumped around, like you said, was in consulting. There's a lot of stuff that's off my resume. And LinkedIn, I was in politics and polling. I ran a state political campaign, was policy research, ran some businesses, and then went into tech, and then in tech have been, in growth and data for a while. So yeah, a winding journey, but really data's at the core of it. Data's a lot of what I studied in school and in grad school, and it's been kind of the central theme, and that brings us here.
Can you go back to Accenture for a minute? And, this is my question, not really about Accenture per se. It's more about the big consulting world and also like doing data inside of large organizations. Your very short blurb about that experience actually seemed very optimistic. It seems like you actually did some pretty cool work there, which sometimes the stories that come out of doing data inside of very large companies, you end up spending more time on organizational dynamics than you spend on data sometimes. Can you talk a little bit more about this experience? Like, what went really well about it?
It might be partly the virtue of being a consultant and being brought in for, very specified pieces of work. But look, the very first thing I did was, Target sends out weekly mailers. So, in lots of the country, you get these physical pieces of mail. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but no. So, Target sends out weekly mailers. And they're basically, specials for, what they're selling and whatnot. There's a lot of data science that goes into what goes on each page of the mailer. Each page of the mailer, what goes at the top, at the middle, at the bottom. So we had the mailer broken out into basically like quadrants and thirds. So like every piece of real estate was coded, and every page had like an ID. If it is snowing in Minneapolis, if we expect the weather in Minneapolis next week to be 40 degrees, this is what we should put on page 2 versus page 1, right? That's the kind of granularity. And that's, that was the first product I did, right? At Accenture. And a lot of these were just very focused on, we have a lot of data. We want to get to, these very discrete outcomes. We want to optimize customer contact strategies. We want to optimize, direct mail strategies, what have you. How do we do that? And so it was, it's kind of the dream for a data scientist in some ways, right? You come in, here's a bunch of data, here's a specific problem, and, what can you do to help us? So I don't know if it's typical or not, but that was my experience.
Yeah, that's cool. In hearing this story, I used to run a marketing team for a long time, and I would always talk about how there's kind of a couple different paths into being a marketing leader. You could be a data person, you could be a brand person, you could be a creative person. And it strikes me that the same is true for data people. Tell me if this is wrong, but it seems like one of the main things that data can be used for is direct response. Having a customer or a voter or a reader of a mailer take some particular action. You were talking about polling very early on in your career. It's not totally dissimilar from like getting people to actually like respond to an ad in a mailer.
Yeah, no, and I would actually go a step further. And this is a whole, different hour that we can come back for. But look, there's only so many types of analysis, period, right? And this is definitely true within a business model. It's definitely true within an industry, but it's also true, across industries. So one of the things I'm noodling on is, if we were to teach analysts and data scientists how to be analysts and data scientists, really we need to teach them 30 types of analysis. That's kind of a hot take. But, there's 30 kind of unique clusters of analysis. And if you knew that, you basically express most of the analytics to, solution problem fit. And I think direct response is one of those, right? How do you predict whether someone is going to do something? How do you make them do something, right? And there's also churn and how long they're going to live and, all these things that we know, right? And many of those problems that, you've covered in your journey in both marketing and data, but there's only so many of these buckets, right? And they definitely span across not just industries, but across, business models as well.
You say this is a hot take. I have a similar gut instinct on that. Do you find that when you express that, is that controversial? Are people like, I'm a unique snowflake. Every analysis that I do is completely different than every, what's the response?
Yeah. I mean, I think look, one of the themes for me, and, I think as both of you know, it's probably a lot of folks out there know I'm on sabbatical for, the rest of the year and doing a lot of just trying to, help, trying to be helpful and advising and peeking at a lot of companies. And the theme that looms largest in my mind, the word that I find myself repeating, 100 times a week is arbitrary, or the phrase is arbitrary uniqueness. And I see this arbitrary uniqueness everywhere, right? And the reality is most companies are not snowflakes, even though the companies would like to think that. And most, data teams are not really snowflakes in terms of the kind of problems they need to solve, even if we'd like to think that. And, I think one of the things that we need to see a lot more of is standardization of the analysis, standardization of the metrics, standardization of the data. I think we'll get there. But yeah, I see this arbitrary uniqueness in a lot of places. And I think there's a natural reaction of, hey, that's a little too reductive, right? And I think, yeah, it is reductive, but it's reductive at the 80-20 point, right? Sure, it's reductive, but I also explain 80% of the variance here, right? And that long tail 20%, of course, you're a snowflake. Of course, you're special and your metrics are special and your data is special and your analysis is special. But if we got to that 80% point, we've unlocked most of the value, right?
I worked with an oil and gas company that did a lot of analysis on finding geological resources. It's like, well, that's a little bit of a different problem set. But like, as long as we're talking about optimizing the 80%, then like, I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I'm so fascinated by this as well. I want to hold that thought on arbitrary uniqueness because as someone who's studied a bunch of companies in my former life, I also have these like standard metrics that I care about, that investors care about. And it's also helpful in framing like, is a good metric, bad metric, if you can see it in context. And context is always the helpful, bigger picture to the puzzle. But I want to get into kind of the meat of the episode. So you're a data person, but you're also a growth person, and you lead both growth teams and data teams. I want to first make sure everyone's coming from the same priors, because growth is this like overloaded term. It's a very hot term, especially in the Valley, which I think maybe created this as like the function you need. It's certainly called something different depending on where you work and maybe if you're outside of the Bay Area. But what does growth mean? What are the different flavors of it? And what is it that's so special about marrying growth teams and data teams together?
Sure, there's a lot there. So yeah, first of all, growth is a highly nebulous term. You ask five people, whether they're growth people or in adjacent functions, what growth is, and you'll get 10 different answers. It's the one job family that's more nebulous than data science, right?
I was going to say that, like, we're already talking about a nebulous field,
right,
and then you add in growth.
Yeah. But to me, there's 3 types of growth teams that I've managed that, back to the 80-20, that really represent most of the work that, so-called growth people do. So the way I think about them is there's funnel hacking teams, there's PLG teams, and there's blue sky bets teams. So funnel hacking teams are, a team that is absolutely founded on experimentation, right? And not in like, we want to be data driven. We want to, this abstract aspirational sense, but in an intrinsic sense, right? This is how the team works. It is founded on experimentation. It's founded on build, measure, learn loops. For these teams, the definition of growth is really the scientific method applied to KPIs, right? You don't have a roadmap. You have an objective to put points on the scoreboard relative to funnel metrics, and to generate learnings. And that's what you're doing, right? So that's that first bucket. The second bucket is PLG. Oh, and I should say about that first bucket, I've seen that work as both a charter team that is, here are your metrics, go off and just experiment, and generate learnings. And work in these build, measure, learn loops as long as you hit your outcomes. I've also seen them work as center of excellence teams, where they're centralized and they'll go out to different pockets of the enterprise. And I've managed both as well. The second is PLG, right? So PLG stands for product-led growth, mostly common in SaaS. Very hot these days. I think it's starting to be rebranded as product-led sales. But to put it simply, it means that you are helping the product sell itself. So that usually looks like you're taking your product, you're externalizing parts of that product to create value before you capture it. Create value for prospective customers that helps turn them into customers. And in practice, that too requires lots of full funnel thinking and lots of experimentation. And then the third is basically blue sky bets teams, which can look like grow at all costs teams, or it can look like long-term skunk works, right? Here's a new direction that we would like to go. It's going to require a lot of experimentation as well. This is very different than kind of the KTLO, the core of the business. But we want to invest in it anyway for frontier work. And we're going to get a cross-functional pot of folks together to move fast, break things, and experiment. So those are kind of the 3 types of growth teams that I've seen, that I manage and how I think about them. When I run these end-to-end, so what I typically do is I run end-to-end growth and data teams. So data full stack, right? So data science, analytics, engineering, platform, all those fun stuff, as well as growth teams. So most recently I had all of those data teams, but I also had product-led growth, growth marketing, and growth product, and started each of those 3 teams, right? I orient them to work as closely as feasible together, right? And I've done this now at several companies. So shared rituals wherever possible, shared training, shared objectives, shared resources, people that can move, from place to place. And that's a sort of unusual model, right? Like I've never really heard of many companies having this, many teams having this. And I think the last thing you'd asked was, what's behind this? And well, I mean, it's simply that, look, when I got into tech, data science was the sexiest job of the century. And then people started talking about growth, and I couldn't have that. I couldn't have a second sexiest job, so I had to bring it in. No, so look, I mean, I think it's a question I get a lot. One, I think there's just a lot of synergies. So I like to say growth gives data context, and data gives growth focus. So growth and the mandates of growth is basically a way to give data teams, analytics teams like a telos, right? It gives them a point, it gives them a perspective. And meanwhile, data teams help growth really zoom in on their efforts, right? Because growth teams could do a million different things, experiment and ideate in a bunch of different directions, and data and these tools of data help growth teams focus. Relatedly, I think data people make the best growth people. And that's another great reason to keep these teams very close together. To the extent that these build, measure, learn loops start with ideation. One of the ways I describe ideation in this idea maze that's at the top of the funnel for experimentation is that you're wandering around a dark cave with a flashlight, with like a dim flashlight. And the most important thing here, the most important first order concern is, where do you point your flashlight next? And data people, and I think UX people as well, UX researchers are really good at that first order concern of, if I'm going to ideate in the first place, where should I point? Where should I point the resources of this group, right? And if you don't treat that as a first order concern, if it's a second order concern, your funnel of ideation is just not going to be very strong, right? At least in my experience. And the third, and I think this is what we'll spend maybe a lot of the rest of our time talking about, is I think growth and data teams are better at what they do when they're tightly aligned on some set of key projects, some kind of shared orientation. And that's something that I think has been clear to me. And I think I've chatted with both of you, right? From prior experiences at companies where, these companies struggle to grow despite growth doing the right thing, data doing the right thing, biz functions doing the right thing, but not really being pointed in the same direction. So anyway, that was a lot. So let me pause there before we go further.
I want to see if you're taking like a super maximalist position or just saying something more measured. There's a lot of different functions in a business, and many of them need data, either at least some or a lot. And maybe one good example to focus this is finance. Finance is pretty far away from the growth team in terms of what they exist inside of the business to do, but they need data a lot. Are you saying that the growth and data teams should be so tightly aligned that their connections with the other parts of the business become attenuated? Like, how do you align data with these other non-growth teams in this context?
Yeah, it's not, I think we'll maybe touch on this a little bit more concretely here in a bit, but it's not that growth and data are just married at the hip and, growth does data and data does growth, but we want to bring the teams closer together. We want to have some shared orientation that report in the same direction. Because if you don't even have that sinew, then it becomes easy to get unmoored. But certainly growth marketing teams should be really tightly aligned with marketing as well, right? Growth product, really tightly integrated into the product world.
100%.
I think one of the other interesting things about growth teams and data teams, they're very cross-functional. So it's like in isolation, either of those teams can't do end-to-end, get something done. They have to work with often like a product and an engineering team to actually make the change or put the experimentation out into the world. Do you staff your growth teams differently than you staff your data teams? Are they this kind of consultative center of excellence, you use that word, where they work with other product teams or they work with other parts of the business to help try these growth experiments? Or do they have their own dedicated resources where they can work in isolation of the other groups?
It depends on the company, depends on the context, but typically, I look for few cross-functional dependencies. We don't want the growth team to be accountable for delivering cross-functional dependencies to other people, certainly not, because we want them focused on, experimentation and driving their own outcomes. And we ideally don't want to depend, too much on other teams as well. So we do try and staff, fully functional. But again, it's just going to depend on the context.
Okay. So you once shared a story publicly about how you were brought in to be a part of a turnaround story. So you were along with some other executives, some company wasn't doing so well, and you were looking to move metrics in a better direction. And you applied the best practices you had with growth and data. Things started to look good for a period of time, and then it capped out. You hit some kind of local maximum and the business kind of reverted to how it was doing beforehand. And so we've talked about this before, is data a necessary but often insufficient ingredient to a company's success? I want to hear a little bit more about the story, like what happened there and how do you work with growth teams to actually move the needle for the business?
Recapping the story a little bit, this was, a company several years ago. The company, I don't mind sharing, the company is called Keep today. It was Infusionsoft at the time. So Infusionsoft, maybe Tristan knows, was a very large MarTech company at one point, right? 100 million ARR, 100 million plus ARR, 40,000 customers, fairly large. People don't talk about them a lot for a variety of reasons.
At one point, it was pretty directly competitive with HubSpot, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it was a big deal for a long time, but growth was slowing. And in the month that I joined, so I was brought in as a wave of leaders to help do this turnaround. In the month that I joined, 100 plus million ARR, 40,000 customers, one net new SMB, right? Which is shocking. So growth had really just, hit a plateau. And so we brought in great operators. I ran growth and data. We brought in great leaders for marketing and sales and customer success, and really tried to turn this company around operationally. And we succeeded. So 12 months later, we went from one net new acquisition to 700 plus, right? Net new monthlies, and revenue growth was even better than that. So things were going great. 12 months after that, the company was losing 200 to 300 customers monthly, right? Hadn't just hit a plateau, but had gone off of the plateau. And, the root cause is, the real root cause at the kernel is that we no longer had product market fit in a good market, right? As Tristan said, at one point, very competitive with HubSpot. This company was founded in 2001, first .com boom. We were sitting here in the mid 2010s, and, the world had changed, customers had changed. And, we were no longer skating to where the puck was going. And again, this was a company that was executing really, really well, right? It was firing at all cylinders. All the functions were performing. The data teams extremely integrated into the company. Growth teams, lots of latitude and support. But all of that executional quality and focus was oriented towards the here and now, where the puck is. And we ended up in a local maxima as a company, right? Basically due to kind of strategic mistakes. So this was a bummer. No, so this was really impactful to me, and I spent a lot of time reflecting on how did this happen? What could growth and data have done? What should they do moving forward? Even when I was there, thinking about how should we orient and structure growth and data to help. And I came up with basically, these answers that fall into kind of these two buckets. How do I orient these teams? And then how do I integrate them into the rest of the company? And so, I can start with, how I orient the teams. And, Tristan, I think this will, speak to, hey, how attached at the hip are growth and data? So when I come into companies,
I'm kind of curious. So back to the story. So you came in, you ran a bunch of analyses, you figured out if we just applied some more energy in this direction, we can right the ship a little bit. And you kept righting the ship until things were looking good for a while. But then again, you hit this, what you described as local maximum, and you felt like you did all of the data work right, the growth work right, but you were missing the bigger strategic bets, or you were just in the wrong market. Is there anything that you've learned there in terms of how do I think about, or is it even the growth or the data team's responsibility? You have a team that you've described as the blue sky bets, which to me sounds like you are starting to think about, are we even pointing the ship in the right direction? Is there a totally net new market or area that the company should be going after? Or is that not really in the remit of the data or growth team?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think, these learnings kind of bubble down into, how do I orient the teams and how do I integrate them? And I think what you're addressing is the latter, how do I integrate? At least that's how I see it. And I think a big part of these strategic misses, right? How do you solve the strategic misses? Is to get data to be involved or own the strategic planning process. And that is, the biggest thing. So, I think I can talk a little bit about how this happened at Flexport because I think we did this pretty well. Let's zoom in on tech at Flexport, which was the org that I was a part of. So when companies do annual planning, there's, the typical planning cascade, right? Mission, vision, strategy, roadmap, tactics. The company does its mission, vision, strategy, and then that cascades down into various functional groups. So zooming into tech, the integration of data into the annual planning process for tech is absolutely essential to ensuring that, we're continuing to be pointed at the right kind of big bets. So what that looks like at Flexport is at the outset, when execs are thinking about it, when the CTO is coming up with the strategy for the tech strategy, data is in the room. And that's because we recognize that strategy will be blind without data. The classic example that I've seen at multiple companies now, where if data wasn't in the room, the company would have made strategic mistakes, is around data network effects. Execs love to talk about data network effects. Every time an exec says we should do X because of data network effects, somewhere a kitten dies. And, data people's job is to prevent that, right? The question is, Flexport could have done, plenty of things to orient around technology strategy anchored on data network effects. But there's fundamental questions. Do we have data network effects? Do they matter? Where do we have them? And if you don't really have clarity on this, but your strategy is, say, data network effects, you're screwed. And this is just one example, but really any strategy, any strategic narrative an organization can align around needs at the point of strategic inception to be rooted in data, at the point of strategic inception to be validated by data folks. So that's where we start, right? So analysts and scientists are there with leadership to define the strategy. Then analysts, they set the metrics, right? In this case, the CTO didn't set the metrics. CTO's directs didn't set the metrics. Analysts, product analysts set the metrics that represent the strategy. They set the North Star metrics. They also lead the translation of those metrics into financial value. So at Flexport, in the last planning cycle, we had 3 North Star metrics. The product analysts set them and they say, this one has this financial value, Y financial value, Z financial value. They then take those metrics and they're the ones that take them down to the PMs and the PM teams. Where the product teams now need to orient around, these North Star metrics. And, they need to come up with their own output metrics and their own initiatives. And who defines the output metrics on the PM teams? It's the product analysts. So it's product analysts actually define the metrics. And this caused plenty of consternation because the PMs didn't agree half the time with the metrics that the product analysts wanted. But the product analysts are accountable to set the metrics for the product teams. In partnership, right, with shared context, but the product analysts are accountable for actually defining what those metrics are and how they relate to the North Star. So then the PMs go and they plan and they say, great, we have our output metrics on the product team. Here they are. Here are my 5 initiatives, right? Then product analysts go in, they take the initiatives and their impact on the output metrics, and they're the ones that score the impact to the tech-wide metrics, right? They're the ones that say, okay, you are going to move this lever, 5%. I have determined that is going to impact the North Star metric by 20%. And then the product analysts are the ones that are sitting in the room to draw the cut lines, right? Now this is very uncommon, but I think it's very essential. And it's an orientation that I wouldn't have been so strident on, if not for experiences like the one at Keep, right? Because this is how you this is how you get data to represent this perspective that prevents, strategic plateauing, right? Where you end up at a local maximum. So I can pause there.
I could not agree more with your high level perspective here. And for me, it comes from my experience at RJ Metrics, where we saw a similar plateauing, and it maybe took us longer than it should have, but ultimately we were led by the data to execute a far too complicated set of maneuvers that ended up resulting in a sell-off of the core business and then a spin out of what became Stitch. And so that's ultimately a pretty good success story, I think. But I think it was because the exec team were all or mostly all data people that we were able to engage in. I think that if the way that you outline this can put the data team in a fairly challenging spot, oftentimes I think that data can tell you a lot about the current state of the machine that you're running. But it can be very challenging to put a data leader and say, like, here's where the puck is going, because most of our analyses are retrospective.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know how you deal with that.
The other really hard part there is I think people are really hard at describing analytically like tail risk or tail successes. So it's like you can create data models or help operate within like a world where like 80, call it even 95% of the time, like the world works like this and you can make decisions or make improvements based on the data of things you've seen or know. But it's the 5% either in the really big success case or in the really bad case that can meaningfully change the direction of a company.
Yeah. So the two things I would say is, I hear that. One is, data is a voice in the room, which is often missing, right? In 90% of companies, it is missing,
Yeah.
but it's not the only voice in the room. And second, to your point on, you can only analyze the data you have. Let's go back to the data network effects example because it's salient in the Flexport context. There was thinking around, should we orient around a strategy that is very data NFX heavy, when analysts couldn't find, because the data isn't there, when analysts couldn't find evidence of, we can spin this NFX flywheel, in the planning cycle itself, the analysts designed, in partnership with growth, designed experiments to see, do we have any early indications that we could spin this flywheel in X area, Y area, Z area, right? So, even in cases where, hey, I only have so much data, we've never studied this before, that itself can be a point of partnership for data and growth to say, can we run some quick experiments to get, some kind of signal here, some kind of direction that can inform this planning process?
This is very much the product manager / investor speaking in me. But like, I keep thinking about the Figma store lately because they just got bought by Adobe. And you look at Sketch, which was like definitely the leader in the design category. Like people use them. Their metrics looked phenomenal. It was an extremely efficient business, 20 people running it, just like printing cash. Things were looking amazing for a long, long time. But what Figma got right was that people cared more about the collaboration piece and they wanted to do it in the cloud and the benefits there. Like you probably couldn't have had a data team or like shown data that this was a bet that was going to pay off because, or maybe you could have, I don't know. Maybe you would argue that yes, an analysis would have told you to stay the course for 5 years, be really heads down in R&D, which is what the Figma team did to build a product that was really excellent at the collaboration piece in cloud. So I am a big believer that data should be in the room, but it's these extreme events that I find it very hard to know how to craft an experiment or like how to even have the growth point of view in something so nebulous or unknown.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's just, what's the counterfactual, right?
Yeah.
It's not like the folks that, aren't bringing the voice of data into the room would be any better at forecasting those tail events.
It's funny. Sometimes I wonder how representative my perspective is here on what does an executive team look like when data is not in the room. It's been 10 years since I've been in that room. I can totally imagine a conversation going off the rails when somebody's talking about data network effects and there's nobody in the room saying like, how would one measure data network effects? That totally makes sense. It's just it's hard for me to even imagine what that conversation looks like.
So I want to go a little bit more into, you talked about this like process that you've set up where data is at the very top and the growth teams are at the very top of like setting the strategy, defining the key metrics that are important. It's often really hard for an individual or a team to have that kind of purview to set the right metrics because very few people at a company have the right scope to actually understand the holistic business. What is it that you've done or that you tell people to do so that they can get to that right level of being able to see the forest for the trees and make these really strategic company level bets?
We talked about lessons from Keep as, how do you integrate these data and growth teams and how do you orient them? And, going back to kind of how you orient them, when I take over these teams, the very first thing I point them to is 2 projects. These are kind of the North Star animating projects. First one is, what I call a dashboard tree. And the second one is, what I call levers. So what a dashboard tree really is just a bounded, cascading, set of dashboards that express, what is the fundamental formula of the business? How does this business actually work, right? When I came into Flexport, we had 2,700 Periscope dashboards for a company of 750 people, right? So
actually 2,700?
Yeah, actually
Wow.
27. It was probably more than 2,700, right? Yeah. So, the first thing that we orient towards is, hey, let's distill all this down into 50. And these 50 are bounded. So, 50, they're cascading. So they have this structure to them that it represents how the business works. So there's kind of an L0. This is how the company works writ large. Zooming in, there's kind of L1s, L2s, L3s, L4s, and it's a tree. We decompose, just like a driver tree, but applied to dashboards. And then in each of those, for that component, we express kind of that fundamental formula of the business, right? And this is all hands on deck. So growth people are doing this, data people are doing this, and this is like a North Star thing that they are all oriented towards. And growth is involved because they're either the SMEs or they're going to really drive the context collection from SMEs on, what does that fundamental formula look like for, function. And, of course, it's going to be in turn, hugely valuable for growth, right? Because it then gives them a picture of how the business works. But, if you can take resources to really focus on, hey, if I were to distill this company down into this kind of master driver tree and really try and understand what metrics make sense. How do people think about, with all of their tacit context, how do they think about what the fundamental formula of the business is today? That makes this job a lot easier. Coming back to your question, Julia, right? If you've done that legwork, if you haven't done that legwork and you're reinventing it every planning cycle, it's always going to be a hard time. It's always going to be a scramble. It's always going to be thrash. But I think people that do this exercise realize, well, first of all, there's a lot of arbitrary uniqueness here, right? It tends to be very similar company to company. And two, the drivers themselves, the relationships may not be durable, but the drivers themselves are pretty durable, right? If you really think about what the drivers are, you find that there's very similar sets of drivers that you don't need to decompose all that much, unless the business, radically changes. So, I think a key part of this is, do that legwork, right? If you can kind of orient, growth and data towards that as a shared project, then you've established that, that groundwork for a shared sense of reality for, all the execs to plan on top of and all the data folks to, drive metrics from.
One of the things that we've been hearing a lot in the industry is we're shifting away from growth at all costs. So people are thinking about growth in contention with costs and trying to be more thoughtful about how they grow. Do you think the growth teams will have to have a new face in more tepid markets, or how can growth teams still be really valuable to companies as we shift into no longer growth at all costs?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the growth team, right? There's certainly some growth teams that are, grow at all costs growth teams, and they'll have some pressures. But, a lot of these growth teams are, fungible through the funnel, or they are full funnel. And, we can take them from, focusing on growing the top line to focusing on growing the bottom line. Instead of pointed at net new customer acquisition, be more focused on cost to serve and retention. And I think we'll see a lot of that. And I think that applies for both data and growth. And I think there's also, aspects of kind of growth tactics like product-led growth, which, are thought of as a way of expanding a market, sure, but it's also primarily a way of expanding a market at, much lower CAC profiles than you used to have, right?
Can we return to something that you teased at the beginning? We were talking about the fundamental similarity of certain types of analysis. A story that I don't often talk about is that the original intent behind DBT was actually to create packages on top of Stitch connectors. And these packages, you could just plug them in on top of, the data loaded into, at the time, just Redshift from Stitch. And you would not just get like a clean set of staging models, you would actually get real business metrics out of them. And the feedback on this version of DBT, that's why DBT had package management from the beginning, which is very unusual for a product like it. But the feedback we got at the beginning was kind of similar to what you were saying before, is that data professionals were like, this is not enough flexibility for me. I need to be able to define the vagaries of the way that this business does this particular metric. I'm curious, is there a set of tooling or technology that is needed in order to make this vision come to life?
Yeah, I am aware that was kind of how RJ Metrics was structured too, right? Back in the day, you were
Yep,
trying to
yep.
do this bundled end-to-end vids, right? Look, history is funny. Sometimes the only path is a winding one. But I think that's the winding path we're on right now, where, we're heading back to that. And, a lot of what the world has produced, what a DBT has produced, a lot of what has been unbundled that has made this possible now makes that vision possible. But I think the reason it failed before, and the reason I think attempts like, Fivetran is, doing these packages, right?
Yep.
DBT has done these packages before, Looker has done these packages.
But I think that the Fivetran packages are mostly like data munching. Or do they go all the way up to like business metrics?
No. So that's what I'm getting at. I think a lot of the problem is that we're starting with source, right? Even the notion of DBT packages starts with source.
Yep.
And I think that's going to be a hard place to start. I think what we see is a lot of arbitrary uniqueness in, let's say, the exposure land of the actual metrics themselves, and the dashboards, and dashboard tree structure.
You want to start from the right and go left instead of left and go right.
That might be arbitrarily unique, but the sources aren't, right? The sources, look, no two Salesforces in the world look identical.
Yeah.
And part of that is arbitrary uniqueness, but a lot of it isn't, right? A lot of it is unique tactical, differences in how, the business is organized, right? So look, I think what's missing here, this is going to happen. And, it's only a matter of time. And it's, I think, in a couple of years. SaaS is SaaS is SaaS. Marketplace is marketplace is marketplace, right? Julia's seen hundreds and hundreds of these companies, right? Julia, these companies fundamentally should have been looking at metrics in very, very similar ways, right?
Yeah.
That would have gotten to them to the 80-20 part. What we're missing is, what is that gap for data, that generally accountable accounting practice.
Yeah.
What is that gap for data that standardizes these metrics? I think there's basically a set of 250 or so metrics and drivers that most SaaS companies can abstract themselves to. Most SaaS companies can hold themselves to. Even if there's slight variations, you can probably find yourself in that abstraction. If we can align on that, and I would actually argue that we can actually align on the dashboard tree and the exposures, the actual exposures themselves. But if we can align on that, then, there's this cool product called DBT Metrics that is designing this metrics layer such that metrics hang off of entities, right? If you standardize exposures, you can standardize metrics. If you standardize metrics, you can standardize entities. If you standardize entities, then the job of data teams becomes map source to target, map source to entities. We're not going to do it for you. It's going to be really hard to do that for you. And yes, there's all these like special snowflake things and whatnot. So it'll always be your job to map source to entities. But if we standardize entities, then, we can simplify that tremendously. And this would be huge, right? This frees up massive amounts of capacity for data teams. It accelerates, the build out of things like this dashboard tree, tremendously, allows them to go up the value chain.
Are you assuming in there that there's some BI capability that can also kind of package up these dashboards, like so they can be distributed in common?
Yeah, I mean, it could happen. I think you start with metrics probably, and then you design those metrics into dashboards and dashboard tree. Because look, if you look at a SaaS business, I would argue the dashboard tree looks very similar too, right? There's an L0 for, let's say, an exec view L0. There's a company-wide L0. There's a board view L0. L1s. Well, what's going on? If I broke up this SaaS business, what's going on in the business? I get customers. There's an acquisition L1. I retain and engage them, right? There's a customer success and experience, L1. I have some kind of value capture. Maybe there's a unit economics L1, right? And so on and so on. But if we actually look at how these SaaS businesses work, right? They work the same way. There's nuances in tactics, but there's not nuances in fundamental mechanics and in fundamental strategy. And I think we actually could very easily live in a world where the dashboards are largely the same. The metrics are even more largely the same. And the entities that power those metrics are definitely the same. And yes, the source is heterogeneous, and that's okay. Map source to entities, right? And I think that will, allow these things to lock into place.
I love hearing you say this because I completely agree that the exciting part about metrics is not about writing YAML. It's like the act of creating a metric is kind of boring. What is really interesting is what downstream changes could happen in the ecosystem if all of this stuff is kind of predefined? Like, how could you create a BI experience that looks different?
And upstream, right? Like upstream as well, because I think the metrics force entities. And honestly, I think the entities are more interesting than the downstream. I think the entities, like if you lived in a world where you standardize these entities, imagine every DBT consumer is using, these standard entities. You create a world where maybe Snowflake sharing from Salesforce or HubSpot or whatever, they couple to these entities as well. So that when Salesforce is sharing its data with you, it's sharing raw data, but it's also sharing the mapped data to this universal entity standard, right? I think entities is very, very powerful, but yeah, downstream as well. But it all anchors on kind of this middle piece, which is, can we standardize the metrics for business models? And I think we can. There's only 12 or so business models out there, right? So if we can start with, say, SaaS and marketplace and e-com and publishing, we can wind our way to representing essentially most of the variants that companies have, right? And once we do that, the real dream is we standardize source. So we'll start with entities, and then I think source is possible too, but it would require a different approach.
GAAP operating metrics. I love it. I would love the world to work that way. And you could just so quickly get to, we have all these rules of thumb, like net revenue retention over 140% is best in class. You have people look at efficiency metrics, and it's oftentimes people have a hard time even defining them. But if we all just realize we're not unique snowflakes, we could shortcut that very quickly.
And DBT could even crowdsource data network effects.
I don't actually need to have a single additional conversation in my career about how to measure net dollar retention. I could never have that conversation again and be very happy.
Okay, let's do it. The future of the semantic layer. We're going to wrap up here. This was a fun conversation.
Wide-ranging, Tristan.
You delivered, yes.
Yeah.
We asked this to all our guests. Looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry? Besides,
let's do what we just talked about.
Yeah,
let's make this beautiful standard reality. Yeah, look, I mean, I think it is possible. We need to really lean into what is arbitrarily unique and what isn't, right? And if we can come together, and I think one of the things that makes that possible is a stronger community than there's ever been before, right? Which I think DBT has, been a large part of. So I think if the community can standardize on some of these exposures, these metrics, these entities, I think that'll go a long way. And, I joked about source, and one day we can standardize sources too. But, I think the pipe dream that isn't impossible, it's really, really hard, but it isn't impossible, is, I would argue, also standardizing lots of sources. One of the things that we did at Flexport, that we are doing at Flexport, is creating this kind of universal information model for information architecture for trade businesses, right? Of which we are only a part, of which they are only a part. And I actually think, if you standardize these kind of metrics and whatnot, these entities, these logical entities, analytical entities on business models, you can actually standardize, and I'll just tease this and then we'll mic drop. You can actually standardize most application databases on industry boundaries. And that will be, I think, very exciting. So we'll solve this problem first, and then we'll go to that one. And then, pina coladas on the beach.
There is prior art for this. Medicare publishes a data model for all electronic health records. And
I mean, everything in data is just reinventing the wheel.
Most industries don't have a Medicare involved, but you can imagine how something like this might come into being.
So if you Google, IBM common data model, Microsoft has a common data model, they actually go out, these big professional services companies go out and they've seen so many of these companies that, they actually have elements of a common data model for industries. And back in the day, you used to buy Teradata, and you used to get the Teradata telecom model, right? Your telecom business, here's your data model, right?
Industries.
Look, parts of this is how the world used to work in part. So much of the modern data stack is reinventing or relearning what happened before, right? But making it work, but making it sexier. And, and so I think there's a lot of learning that we could capitalize where we take that prior art and we bring it back. And I think it's possible. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. This was a lot of fun. We're going to wrap here. Thanks for joining us, Abhi. The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.